My name is Evgeni. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator for the Elk River Alliance. And today I'll be talking to you about Whirling Disease. So just to start off, how many of you have heard about Whirling Disease? Okay, most of you, awesome. Any of it from, how many of you have heard of it through Elk River Alliance? A couple, okay. How many of you have heard of it through recent news? A lot, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, so Whirling Disease affects salmon fish such as trout and mountain whitefish, and it results in these symptoms. So it results in this kinked spine, especially in young fish. It results in a blackened tail. It results in a whirling swimming pattern, so they swim around in circles, which is a key behavioral symptom, and eventually it leads to death. In some watersheds, it has been recorded that 90% of young fish have died out, which has caused, obviously, huge impacts on the fishing industry in those places. So Whirling Disease is a fish originally from Europe, and it's made its way to North America in the 1950s. In 1958, there was the first confirmed case in Pennsylvania, and then it spread throughout the United States eastward throughout the 1960s to the 1990s. In the 1990s is when you had the Colorado outbreak that killed 90% of the rainbow trout. And then in 2016 was when we first detected it in Canada in Banff's Johnston Lake. And the Elk River Alliance education program on Whirling Disease started in 2021. So this was actually before we had Whirling Disease in British Columbia. So a lot of our materials are already outdated because we say Whirling Disease is not yet in BC, because in 2023, in last September, as a lot of you saw, we have recorded Whirling Disease in BC waters in Emerald Lake in Yoho National Park. This is a big deal because currently Yoho and Kootenai National Parks are closed to all aquatic recreation. You cannot have any boats in there, you cannot fish in there, you can swim in there, and if boats are already in there, then I think they can move around. In Waterton, only boats that are already in the lake can be used. You cannot actually put them in from anywhere else. So it obviously has a huge impact in recreation, and this kind of fate is potentially what faces the Elk River watershed if we're not careful. So on this map, you can see on the left here the distribution of Whirling Disease in Alberta. So you can see it spread throughout the kind of southern part of the province. And you can see Emerald Lake is kind of close to just north of Banff there. And then the Elk River watershed, which we see in this little cutaway here, is right beside the Crow's Nest watershed. The Crow's Nest watershed does have Whirling Disease. It's a 15-minute drive away from where we are right now. It is, not right now, but from the Elk River watershed. So it's a matter of somebody being careless with their equipment to transfer it into our watershed, and that could result in the recreational activities being carried out here. But even more than that, we are at pretty much the top end of the Columbia watershed. So here you can see the entire Lake Columbia River watershed. This is us. If we get Whirling Disease in our waters, it will go all the way downstream because it is an aquatic-borne disease. So let's talk a little bit about the biology of Whirling Disease. So the parasite is actually called Myxobola cerebralis. It's an cnidarian, which means it's essentially a freshwater jellyfish relative. And there's two main stages. So one of the stages is called the TAM stage, or for the nerds, the triactinomyxin stage. And it's this like three-pronged kind of jellyfish-like thing, and this is the free-floating stage that actually exists in the water column. And then there's the spore stage, and the spore stage is a little bit bigger, it's much hardier, and it kind of sinks down to the sediment. There are two main hosts to Whirling Disease. The first is, as I've said, salmon fish, such as west-lobe cutthroat trout, mountain whitefish, and rainbow trout, all of which we have in this watershed. And the other is the tubifex worm. So the tubifex worm lives in silty environments, and it is present in the Elk River watershed. So we have the fish, we have the worm, all that we need to complete the cycle is the actual parasite. So the actual parasite cycle goes like this. You have the spores that are in the mud. The worm eats the spores, and in its gut, they transform into the TAM stage. The TAM stage gets released as the worm dies or poops, and then it gets into the water column, it floats around until it attaches to a fish, and then it infects the fish, and when the fish, inside the fish, it turns back into spores, and when the fish dies, the spores get released. So the reason the symptoms happen is, some of the digital artifacts didn't work out there, but basically, that's funny. Basically, it attaches to the fish skin, it attaches to the mucous cells, and then it injects its own cells into the fish. The fish then travel down the nervous system to the cartilage of the fish. This is why this especially impacts young fish, because young fish have more cartilage, and the cartilage hasn't become ossified or hasn't turned into bone yet. And so, in the cartilage, they eat and degrade the cartilage, and that causes inflammation in the fish. The inflammation puts pressure on the pigment cells of the fish, and that causes the blackened tail, and the inflammation causes the deformation in the king spine, and eventually that's why they kind of spin around in circles, which means that they're a lot more susceptible to predators, which is often why they eventually die. So the Elk River Alliance project on Whirling Disease aims to do two main things. The first is doing exactly what I'm doing right now. It's educating the public on the dangers of whirling disease and the vectors of disease spread. And the second is to monitor the presence of the tubifex worm, which is one of the main hosts. So we have a bunch of different stations. We have 10 cabin sites, and we have 5 tubifex monitoring sites. And we do eDNA sampling. eDNA sampling means we collect kind of a water sample, and then a lab takes that water sample and it processes it, and then it matches it to different sequences that are known, and then it tells us what's in the water. And then if there's tubifex worm detected, it tells us, yes, there's a positive match for tubifex worm. So essentially we're trying to assess which areas of the watershed are most susceptible to the spread of whirling disease. So what can you do? The main things that you can do is to clean, drain, and dry all of your equipment. That means any sups, any boats, any waders, any tubes, literally anything you can think of that can go between water bodies needs to be completely dry and clean before you transfer to a different water body. And this is because the spore stage of whirling disease is really hardy. It can survive several days in mud outside of and it can survive being dried. So you might not think that anything is living in there, but you could actually transfer it by transferring some muddy boots or something. So make sure that all of your boots don't look like that. They're completely cleaned off. And this is in the wrong spot, but ultimately the clean, drain, dry protocol also prevents the movement of other invasive species, notably the zebra and quagga mussels, which are not yet in BC, and the Eurasian milfoil, which is currently in BC, but we still want to prevent its spread throughout different watersheds. Back to the main event. You see, draining means you drain your boat. A lot of boats take in water, and there's a little valve that you can open and drain it out, so make sure it's completely drained. And make sure that every part of your boat, your equipment, your fishing gear, like your buckets, whatever, is dried for, I believe it's at least 42 hours before you transfer it to a different part of the watershed. Another really important thing is to actually comply with the law and use the watercraft inspection stations. They're really good at looking for signs that your equipment is not fully clean, drained, and dried. We have one between Fernie and Sparwood, as a lot of you know, so if you are transferring even a sup or something, make sure to stop by there. Never ever transfer fish or fish parts between different streams. I feel like that goes without saying. I don't know why anybody would do that, but if you have some equipment or a knife or something, or some guts get stuck to a bucket, never transfer it into a different stream, because that's one of the number one ways of spread of whirling disease. of course, report any fish that you suspect of whirling disease. So look for the blackened tail, look for the whirling behavior, look for the kinked spine. Deformities can happen for a lot of different reasons, but it never hurts to report. So just take a photo, make sure you note the location of where you are, note the fish species if you can, and then send an email to info@elkriveralliance.ca, and we'll make sure it gets passed on to the people who need to deal with it. Before I get into some Elk River Alliance stuff, I would like to thank the Columbia Basin Trust and the Freshwater Fisheries Society of BC for funding this program that we have, and our partners at the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council for providing some information on other invasive species. So the Elk River Alliance, I imagine a lot of you, who's heard of the Elk River Alliance? Good. There's a few ways that you can support us. One of the ways is to volunteer. So please go to elkriveralliance.ca/volunteer. We have different programs that you can volunteer for that cater to different interests. You can help us with outreach, so you can operate kind of like Alicia is at the back there. Give a little wave, Alicia. You can operate our informational booths at summer markets or at river access locations. You can help us out with monitoring, so the tube effects monitoring. So if you're interested in learning about what goes into an environmental career, this is a really great opportunity to be like, okay, you go out with an actual ecologist and you do some monitoring yourself. And then you can help out with your restoration effort. I just want to shout out to everybody who came out to our restoration effort this last spring. We had 6,000 live stakes planted, over 1,000 work hours completed. It was a really intense push and it really paid off. The site at Morrissey Meadows looks really incredible right now. You can also support us by becoming a member. A single membership is $20 per year, family membership is $50 per year. You get a cool sticker and a postcard, and it really helps us to show to decision makers, governments, and funders that we have community support. So this is really important for us. You can get a membership tonight with Alicia back there. And for those of you with younglings, you get early bird access to our Elk River Discovery Camps, which are often very busy and sell out. And finally, you can become a donor. We're really encouraging monthly donations right now, so for just $15 a month, you can make a huge difference to our organization. We really encourage you to do that by going to elkriveralliance.ca/donate or talk to us. With that, I would like to really thank everybody for listening, and I will take any questions.
Now I'd like to introduce Clayton Lamb. Anyone here never heard of him before? Cool, great, you've got a lot of friends. Well, as most of us know then, he's a wildlife biologist from the area, lives south of town now, lived in Fernie for quite a while. He's worked with First Nations, government, community groups to pair science and collaboration. He's worked with reconnecting the Rockies, eliminating roadkill dumps that were attracting bears, lots of amazing stuff that he's up to. Also, of course, he's a recreationalist, just like us. Hey, do we have any bikers in the crowd here? Anyone here that likes mountain biking? Oh yeah, a couple of those. Anybody here that likes trail running? Any trail runners here? Yeah, okay, we've got a couple. Anybody here that likes fishing? Oh yeah, okay. Anyone hunting? Any hunters? Yeah, okay. Any motorbikers, quadders? Yeah. Okay, right on. We got a couple of those. Okay, cool. I just wanted to get a quick sense for the crowd there. But without further ado, let's welcome Clayton Lamb. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, thanks for taking time out of your day to come and listen to a talk instead of doing your fourth ride of the day as you forget student. I did my first one. It was a big deal. First ride of the day. But I want to talk to you about sort of some of the science about wildlife recreation, like what we know proper as a scientific community about recreation and wildlife, and then a project that I've had going in Fernie here. So yeah, we're going to talk about the state of science, Fernie project, some unknowns. You know, recreation ecology is fairly a new science. 50 years ago, people weren't really recreating like we do now. They were like, trying to save for a mortgage and doing whatever they were doing. And now we're all out playing and biking and maybe still saving for a mortgage and renting. So it's a new thing to have this many people out on the landscape. Like it's unprecedented in like human history to have so many people like having free time and doing fun things out there, which is great to be a recreationist. But it's a different time. And then some take home. So I'll talk to you about a bunch of things, and I hope there's a couple things that you might be able to remember from this. So, just some cautions. The project I'm going to talk about, the Mount Fernie project, has been going on for 3 years. So there's an extensive data set, but I first analyzed it last Friday. So it's these are early results, and I just say that with caution, and that like don't take something here and be like, Clayton said mountain bikes were the worst thing or the best thing, and now we're just going to make decisions with that. So like there's information here, and it's going to be useful and interesting, but like if you're going to advocate for a position or like make a landscape decision, contact me, because this is an ongoing thing and there'll be more solid results moving forward. But the good news is you're the first to see it, so it's an exciting time. Woohoo! Yeah. And then because I'm a scientist, watch for uncontrolled variables. There'll be all kinds of things you're like, see, look, that's what I thought. And then you'd be like, no, actually it's because I put the camera in the wrong spot or there's some confounding variable. So just interpret with caution is the thing. I will point out all the potential pitfalls, because that's what I'm good at. So recreation ecology as a whole, so I can see what we're actually presenting here. It is defined as like the study of environmental consequences of outdoor recreation, or the study of the impacts of recreation on the environment. And I think that's true. That's what it's designed for. But in a lot of ways, we're not just looking for the negatives of it. And I think a true study of recreation ecology is looking at sort of the true spirit of ecology, which is how does this impact the way that animals move across the landscape, how their abundance is structured and distributed across the landscape, the pros and the cons in a true ecological sense. So like, at least when I came to this, it was like, I was out mountain biking on Mount Fernie all the time. I had a condo out by Stanford and was like, is this good or bad? There's moose here, and there's grizzly bears here, like maybe this isn't so bad. I'm gonna find out. And so the whole field of recreation ecology is maybe slowly shifting from this recreation ecology, like why is it bad, to like a recreation ecosystem, understanding that like, I think we want people out there enjoying the landscape. Like we don't want everybody inside their house and you can't go outside and that's like the only spot that you can be and the rest is all for wildlife. I think we want people outside enjoying landscape, but also sort of within the bounds of what will work for wildlife as well. So sort of that compromise, and probably looking at what the pros and cons of that. Like there's winners and losers, for example. A good example would be if, say, recreationists scare away all the predators. There's no wolves, you can't have a grizzly bear here, there's no cougars, it's all bad for them. Well, it's probably good for deer. Like there's winners and losers in these kind of games as you shift wildlife around. And so the goal is to say like, what is happening? What is the impact and how do we mitigate it if there is a problem? This is my goal. And as you as recreationists, as human beings who like peruse social media and see things, there's all kinds of opinions on recreation and its effects. It ranges from people that think it has absolutely no effect and they're out in harmony with wildlife when they're like going 43 kilometers an hour down a mountain. It's not a particularly harmonious thing. And people that think that it's the worst thing in the world. And that like there's only bears in town because we built a bunch of mountain bike trails, and every single thing is to do with that there's more mountain bikers. And both of those things I can say with certainty are not true. Those two ends of the spectrum are both wrong. That's a fact. But unfortunately, somewhere in the middle is the truth, and it's hazy. And that's what we need to figure out. Where along the spectrum is this kind of recreation ecology conundrum? So you'll see like 3 slides that intersperse it with like a video of a grizzly bear doing something just to like keep you interested. I showed it to my wife and she was like, yeah, this seems really interesting to you. So I put this disclaimer there. Okay, so a bit of text here, but there's been all kinds of work on recreation ecology for decades. Some of it is good, some of it's not that good, to be honest, too. And that's challenging for the public. It's like science is challenging in that, you one day alcohol is good for you, you drink more wine, and the next day it's not, like that kind of thing. Recreation ecology has a similar problem, and it depends what quality the science is. And a good example is like an observational study where you just go like look around and be like, are there more bears on this trail than a wilderness area, and you try to make an inference. Is different than like an experimental study where you have this wilderness area, punch a bunch of trails into there and say like, is this place different because of the trails? That's like a strong inference, whereas observational stuff where you just go and look around is weaker and you can get some haywire things. What these folks did was they did a global review of all the science that was ever done on recreation ecology to figure out what happened. And their one thing was that there's not many publications and there's knowledge gaps, which is not a very satisfying conclusion, as you can imagine. And if you're a wildlife manager, like if you're somebody in Cranbrook deciding whether to permit the next trail, it's kind of hard. Like, is it good or bad? 93% of the reviewed articles documented at least one effect of recreation on animals, and they say the majority of which were negative. That sounds bad, but the majority is 59%. That is not like an overwhelming majority. That means, I didn't look at whether the rest were like neutral or positive, but like, a red flag for me would be like 90% or 80%. So like not a smoking gun there, but certainly negative effects we have to be cautious of. And this one comes up a few times, we'll talk about it. A lot of the reviewed literature said that counter to public perceptions, non-motorized was worse than motorized. And that, just like a human being, I don't believe that in my brain, but I believe it because I'm a scientist. I'm like, okay, like if that's what the data say. And there was something about snowmobiles. Snowmobiles are also, or snow recreation, can have an even bigger effect. So this is kind of like looking at the whole landscape of what was published. And this is kind of a common thing that most of these recreation studies come to. They say, this is just taken right over the abstract of a certain paper, but it's basically what most recreation studies come to. And in some ways, I might show you that this is all that mine comes to. So, I'll just be another data point in the next global study. But species temporarily, so within a day, avoid recreationists and basically like move their day plan around so that they're not there when you're there, which makes sense. So they're still in the landscape, but they're not going to be there in the busy times. A bunch of other species are like, it's too busy here, I'm out of here, and I'm not going to use this trail itself, but maybe I'll be a couple hundred meters away. So they have an avoidance of the recreation, but they're still kind of in the general area, so it's like a spatial shift. And these folks say that species responded to non-motorized recreation more often than motorized recreation, which again surprises me, but that's what people are finding. Now your video. This is from, where's it from? Oh yeah, Fat Bastard. Part of my interest here is to just put like really inappropriately named trails in the peer-reviewed literature. Just to see if I can get away with it. They're all like little acronyms because like, I don't know, I can't type that out and show people that. Okay, just a couple more slides here on this kind of review. This stuff's better, I think. This is kind of the stuff that if I was making a decision on landscape, that I would think really hard about. This is experimental evidence. This is where somebody has like a collared elk, and they say, this is in Oregon. It's a controlled national forest where like nobody's doing anything and you can just like play science games kind of thing. And they did an experiment where they would basically approach these collared elk and measure their response based on different types of recreation. Then they'd leave the elk alone for like 2 weeks and see what they did with nothing, and then repeat this. And they measured a whole bunch of things, but one was like, how far did the things run away when you went by, which is a good measure of like, how scared were you? And because you imagine you walk past this thing, it doesn't move, it's not very scared of you. And this one kind of more closely follows just my intuition of what would happen. So this is the flight distance from the recreationist over a bunch of different replications. ATV, they're talking about moving somewhere on the order of 750 meters from every ATV, and all the way up to 4,000 meters, so 4 kilometers, long ways. And then it kind of goes down from there. All these things have an effect though. Bike as well, hikers, and then horses. That, I don't know, that kind of checks my like sniff test on how I think the world works. There's other things where they really monitored these out closely and saw like how when different recreation types went by them, how it changed their behavior. So if they ran away, they're then by definition not doing something they would rather be doing, like sleeping, eating, doing whatever. And so, as an ATV goes by, they spend less time feeding, for example. So there's cost to that animal. They can do these kind of really like fine scale looks at how recreation changed the day for those animals. So I think that's pretty like strong evidence that there is an effect. Doesn't mean that there's fewer elk or that the world's going to end, but like that's an effect on those animals. Another one was looking at building a trail. So they had information before the trail was built, cameras all along where the trail was going to get built. Then they built the trail, they monitored while the trail was getting built, and then after. These are, like I hate to say it, they're kind of what we think of like garbagey type species. They're like raccoons and white-tailed deer and possums. they're the kind of things like in British Columbia you wouldn't like get off worried, but if you're in like Maine, New York or something, maybe it's a big deal. So these are the kind of animals that habituate better than something like a wolverine or a grizzly bear or even an elk. But in this case, the animals were kind of doing fine. They spaced away during the trail building, and they went back to doing exactly what they were doing after the trail was there, despite a bunch of recreationists. Again, these are like animals that can habituate, so I don't think that same thing would happen with our assemblage of wildlife, but given what they had, there was not a big effect in their landscape. I don't think that has to be the same here. The final one is COVID closures, which is not really an experiment, but it's close in that you have all these national parks, you have all these trails, all these places that people used to use, and then the only thing that changes is people stop using them, or vice versa, they start using them at really intense levels, depending on if the trail's close to, Vancouver or here or versus out in the bush. And, this comes to sort of a conclusion of when they open these trails back up, or these parks, there's pretty consistent reductions in wildlife. So when it was closed, the animals kind of like came back on the landscape and were more present and more available. And then when they opened the parks back up after COVID restrictions ended, the animals kind of pulled back again. So, I think the animals were sensing that human presence on the landscape, and it's shifting their use of the landscape. There was some cool things. This was in, I think it's in Garibaldi Park there near Vancouver. And in this case, I don't know if you can see this very well, but pre-closure, there was not very many black-tailed deer seen in this area, and then a few cougars. And then they closed it, and all of a sudden there was, I got that backwards. There was a bunch of deer, not many cougars, because there was a bunch of people on the trail. Then they closed it, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of cougars and no deer, because there's so many cougars. And then they opened it, and the people came back, and once again, there was a bunch of deer and not many cougars. So, basically people are changing the way that cougars use that landscape, and the deer is responding to what the cougars are doing because it's safe. So, that's not good or bad per se, it's just we have an effect, and the cougars probably don't like our effect, and the deer probably do. Okay, so this is our landscape, something that probably all of you hold near and dear, and it's a world-class trail network, and you probably get a lot of joy out of it every day. I do. I'm also an ecologist and conservationist, and I think about the way that animals move across the landscape and how we have one valley to look after, and I also look at that and think like, oh, that's looking pretty busy, because there's a hard footprint that, a grizzly bear is definitely not going to walk through Fernie. And if they do, it's a bad deal. And then, there is an expanding footprint for sure. The one thing that works on this is still this red dot. So, what effect does this have? Are we living within the bounds of the valley, or what? Is this good or bad? And that's what we kind of set out to start chipping away at. So, again, I was just sort of interested in this and saw all these studies coming out. One that came out of the Chilcotins in BC during COVID that said that ATVs were worse than mountain bikes. And I was like, I just don't know if that's true. And so I had all these cameras, and I was living in the Stanford, and was like, we're gonna do it. We're gonna figure it out. So I put up all these cameras, and they are structured in basically 3 different types of cameras. So one is on wildlife trails. So just the animal trail that was always kind of there, very few people. On roads, so the Powerline Road, or on the road up to Island Lake, and then on mountain bike trails. So 3 different sort of
trail types. And so the next thing I'm going to show you is just kind of a random series of some photos from P9 on the P9 app. So all kinds of things going on here. This is not proportionate to the amount of photos, because you would have like 9,000 bikes and one elk. It gets boring after a while, but the elk's cooler, you know. But these are the kind of photos that you see. It's cool. It's data. There's lots of use. It's a cool place. This one's kind of cool. This is on Fat Bastard too. Yeah, right above the Dairy Queen is a mountain goat, and in between people. So it's hard on the video to always keep track of the times, but the times are cool to see how animals are inserted between people. So this is September 4th at 9 o'clock. When does it start? Oh god. Yeah, 8:58 and then 9:30. These are tight times. That is very likely a dispersing mountain goat. That's not a normal spot to find a goat. And that's the only goat that's been here, so it's a one-off. But it's maybe dispersing off the ski hill kind of thing, going over to Three Sisters or something. But it jumped on that trail and was making the best of it. And sandwiched between a bunch of bikers. I suspect the goat was not keen, and I don't know if anybody caught up to the goat. Just to note that we. In general, most or everybody is blurred in the data. So we have an AI system that'll just put a box on everybody. I unblurred them just to show you, so it's not as hard to see. You just see a bunch of moving blurs, but always select photos so that you can't really tell who's who. So people's privacy is a big one here. So that everything's kind of blurred for any kind of outreach or any time we could identify an individual. And okay, so besides a bunch of cool photos, what do we want to know? One was, are wildlife using bike trails, roads, and adjacent wildlife trails at different levels of intensity? Just are there more deer on one versus the other? Are there more elk on one versus the other? And then, are they using them different temporally? So are they using a road at different times of the day than they are a wildlife trail, for example? And then, within a trail, are they responding differently to the types of recreationists? So as an elk, do you do something different when you see or hear a biker versus a quadder versus a hiker kind of thing? Is it different between trail type? So the study, it's been 3 years of data collection. It's mostly been 3 years of me just mountain biking and thinking that it was work. Which is why I never analyzed it, because it was just more fun to go collect it. And so there's 29 cameras out there, and they have collected 1.7 million photos, which is an unfathomable amount of data and volume. And somebody has to go through all of those. I trained a computer to pull out the bikers, because the two wheels on a bike and a human is a very distinct type thing. And hikers are distinct, but somebody still goes through hundreds of thousands of those photos, and that person is not me. But yes, it's a big job. And of all of those photos, there's been almost 200,000 detections. And what that means is a bunch of those photos are duplicates of the same individual. So they're cool cameras that they take photos as fast as they possibly can. So if you walk through Fat Bastard, and I need to find another trail now, I'm stuck on that one. If you walk through swine flu and you walk past one of the cameras, it might get 30 photos of you. It's just as fast as it can, so that a running elk or something, it doesn't miss, kind of thing. So a detection is then one of those events, and an event of me walking past it might be 40 photos, kind of thing. So that's why there's 1.7 million images, but 200,000 detections. And of those, half of them are bikes. 100,000 detections of bikes. 30,000 vehicles, so of course these are on roads, and one of the roads is Island Lake. 25,000 humans, which is hikers. There's obviously a human on every bike, but they don't get counted twice. 20,000 dogs. And then noticeably it changes here quite dramatically. We're talking about double to triple digits, 6 figures, 5 figures of recreationists, and then down to, 4 figures and less for wildlife. So the most abundant wildlife is a white-tailed deer, and we're talking about 3,800 of them. Mule deer, 1,400, elk, 900,
and 99 grizzly bears. There's a bunch of other things, but this was just an example of this sort of magnitude of what we're talking about here. So this is sort of the raw data of the detection rates at different types of roads. Single track are all the bike trails, and then these are wildlife trails by different species. Oh, I'll show you a plot with each species broken out. But this was what invited my precaution of confounds. Because this would be like, well, we should just build more roads. That's the answer. And this is a confound in that like all the roads are going somewhere. Like Island Lake is going up the valley bottom to a great spot for a wildlife. It goes over a pass, whereas swine flu is this like tortuous thing that goes nowhere down to the visitor center. So like, you know, it makes sense that there's fewer wildlife there, for example. This is a fair comparison though, because the single track are, you know, they're all basically up and down slope, a lot of them, except say Lazy Lizard. And I paired them with wildlife trails that were doing similar things. And so this is more of a fair comparison. We're thinking like, are animals using wildlife trails and bike trails at the same rate? And I would say no. Like, I think there's certainly a little bit of a dip here. You could also say that like, this is pretty high for something that's seeing like hundreds of thousands of people on it. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to look at it. This is by species. I mean, we don't get too caught in this, but it's just to kind of point out there's all kinds of different things going on. One is that the predators, and this is well known, predators often move on roads. Doesn't mean the roads are even good for them. You know, you'll see grizzly bears on the side of the road in Banff all the time, and that white bear just got killed with its 2 cubs this week. So animals make not ideal decisions as well. So where they are isn't always the best thing. But, you know, black bears, wolves are known to use roads to hunt. And, you know, there's different things like white-tailed deer, of course, are kind of more on the wildlife trails, as you would kind of expect. These grizzly bears are just moving along the roads, so trying to get to A to B, probably. So there's all kinds of things that we can kind of pull out here. The only thing that's doing anything like an animal should is the snowshoe hare. It's the only wildlife in here, it seems like. The rest of them are adapting to the landscape. Like, they either have to figure out how to live here and move around here or not, kind of thing. There's lots to pull out here, but I think we can't get bogged down in all the different species. One thing you can look at is how within a type of road surface, more people change the use of wildlife. So on the y-axis here is the number of wildlife detected per month, and then on the x-axis the number of people. Notice they're like orders of magnitude difference. This goes for people like 0 to 1,500 a month, and wildlife goes from 0 to 80 or 60 a month. You know, like, there's a weak decline. It's not as weak as, or it's not as strong as I would expect if you go from like no people all the way to like 1,500 people a month. Again, this isn't accounting for like if that was just a better trail that both people and wildlife like better, but you know, big, really strong effects do often come out through that. There's an effect there, but it's not super strong. An easier one, and maybe a more compelling way to look at this, is how animals are using a single trail and all the trails averaged across through the time of day in relation to bike traffic, for example. So this, on the x-axis, the time of day, goes from midnight, this is morning, 6 a.m., noon, 6, and night. So this is no surprise. People wake up, they bike, and then they, you know, have an afternoon, there's a little afternoon bump, and then people go to bed. So this is kind of the distribution of when bikes are on the landscape. This is the distribution of elk on the landscape. These are just on bike trails, by the way. So you can kind of see that they are not overlapping. It doesn't mean that they're avoiding bikers. Elk also just do this, but they are not overlapping, or trying to. This is a white-tailed deer. Again, red is the wildlife trail, black is the bike trail. This one you can see a similar thing in that they are actually probably shifting how they are using most of their day. So a single track trail, they're starting earlier, they're using the trail earlier, and then using it less during the day, and then they're using it later in the day. And then the red you can see on the wildlife trails, they're using it, you know, maybe an hour later, and then using it more during the day. This is the higher piece, and then higher over here. So, I think that's evidence that the animals are responding. This is very small scale, like hundreds of meters away. And both really good trails. No bike trails, probably better to move on. The rest, it's dicey. Probably because of small sample sizes. These are mule deer, it starts to get pretty bouncy. I don't see a lot there. Grizzly bears is really strong, but it's because grizzly bears mostly don't step on those bike trails. You'll see a couple examples, I'll show you some, but the ones that we did detect were very strongly outside the biking window. I would say this is maybe strong, but also a small sample size problem, but the bikes on the single track, are trying to avoid, and on the wildlife trail, there are just not many bikes, not many bears as a whole, grizzly bears. Black bear, not much here. They spend a fair amount of time out active while biking is happening, which is maybe not a problem from the bear's perspective, but you can flip this and say, like, how do you keep recreationists safe? This says that basically most of the time you're out recreating, you should be thinking about black bears, because there's a lot of overlap. Another way to look at this is avoidance ratio. So it's kind of like that goat, in that if you're biking and you're the camera kind of thing, and a human goes by, and it's say 10 o'clock, and then immediately after that, 5 minutes later, there's an elk. And then it takes, an hour for the next bike to come by. You would kind of think like, well, that elk didn't mind going up the trail right after a mountain bike. But if it flipped around, where a bike went by, and it took like 2 hours for an elk to go by, and then as soon as the elk went by, a bike came by, you get a sense that elk was trying to avoid the bike that had just gone by. And so you can kind of get a sense of if animals are avoiding the last bike or last recreations that went by with these kind of avoidance ratios. So the data is well set up for that, because there's a bike, there's a moose, there's a moose calf, and there's a biker. These are all, the moose calf was at 7:17, and then the next biker was at, let's watch it. I can't lie to you. 1917, 7:17. Yeah, so about 4 minutes later.
Wow.
So this is tight. So we can look at that across a whole bunch of different things. So the avoidance ratio, if it's 0, it means there's basically no avoidance. There are recreationists are kind of randomly some minutes before and some minutes after every wildlife. Or if the avoidance ratio is high, it means that animals are probably avoiding that recreation type. And if the avoidance ratio is low, it means they're actually selecting to be near the time since somebody just was there, which could be dangerous if it was a grizzly bear. And there's a whole bunch of things that are going to pop up here. It's not my most beautiful plot, I must say, but it's full of information, but I'll try to walk you through it. Recreation, there's going to be 3 different types. So bikes are going to be in red, humans are going to be in green, and vehicles are going to be in blue. And then all the different animals. So black bears here, elk, grizzly bear, moose, mule deer, red fox, and white-tailed deer. And there's a general trend that I can see in this. So again, vehicles are in blue. Here, 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 and here. I think if you squint, and you don't have to squint that hard, that those blue lines are more often higher than this dotted line, and they're higher than most other lines, the blue. I'm sorry if you're colorblind. These are not great color schemes, but if you see my little dot here. So probably some avoidance of vehicles. I think that these data kind of show that. The rest, and these are on roads, of course, which is where vehicles are. And bikes, not much. Humans, not much. We're straddling 0. Same kind of thing. There's lots of variation. There's obviously avoidance and attraction, and then nothing. This is for single track. So this is where there's most data, because there's the most cameras and the most hit rates. For again, bikes in red, and then humans in blue. Not huge. Maybe grizzly bears and avoiding hikers a little bit, and some of these straddle different sides of 0. But it's not as if they pull away from that line completely. So not huge avoidance that way. This is on the wildlife trail, so there's a few people that walk up the wildlife trail. Some of this might be me, because I have to walk up the wildlife trail. I'm also there. And, you did detect some disturbance and some avoidance. So, these guys, and definitely pulling away from that one line. And that's consistent with a lot of literature that, when animals start getting habituated to disturbances, they can sometimes handle them, but here it's supposed to be their safe spot, So going in there in an area they're not expecting to have people, they can start avoiding quite strongly. I don't remember what happens here. Oh yeah, a little black bear. It's pretty cool. Despite the thousands of photos, I go through them all because I'm always looking for these cool sequences because it's crazy what happens. And with the data, we can look at how often is somebody really close to a dangerous animal. So 3 species here: black bears, grizzly bears, and moose. Probably you'd agree are quite dangerous. Moose, statistically, may be the most dangerous. This is when so HW is when there was a human and then a wildlife. And then the other one is when there was a wildlife and then a human. So the time between those 2 sequences. So these are the distribution of time. So this is 0 minutes, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 60 minutes. So the time between when there was a person and then a black bear, there's lots where they're almost 0, which that one was. It was very short. And there's a bunch that are under 10 minutes. So there's lots of people that are going by this camera and then within 10 minutes there is a black bear. It's a small percentage of the total people. We're talking about thousands of people that have gone by this camera, but it happens. Grizzly bear, same thing. This one, it's not a great image, but I was like, no way, why is it? It was actually 0, and so I went and found the image. And it's a grizzly bear back in the bush that the AI picked out and put a box around it. Everything is scored by a human. A human says that's a grizzly bear, but there's an AI program puts a box around things that are likely people and animals. And this person, it's on stove, goes up stove, and they pass the camera, and you see them back up, and the AI picks up this grizzly bear, and there's a grizzly bear in the back, looking at this guy. Yeah, yeah. So that was that. I thought it was a data error. And yeah, moose, same thing. Lots of less than 20 minutes, and then vice versa when there's a wildlife and then a person. So that person's then following that bear, right? Or that moose kind of thing. So some of these people, a moose walks by, and numerous times there is a person directly behind after that moose goes by. Not great. Okay, so what did we learn? Are wildlife using bike trails, roads, and adjacent wildlife trails at different levels of intensity? Yes, yeah, they are. They seem to prefer roads and wildlife trails, but it's likely due to the ease of movement. And so I think there's probably something on my end where it's have to figure out the tortuosity of those trails. Is this bike trail even a good spot to move as a whole for an animal? Would I expect it to be a movement corridor? That's the confounding variable I said to watch out for. And are animals using trails different temporally? And I think the answer is yes to that too. I think there's fairly clear evidence that those elk are shifting a little bit of their evening activities. The whitetails seem to be fairly strongly shifting, the way they're using the day as a whole. These aren't huge changes, but it's messing up their day. Do wildlife respond differently to hikers, bikers, and motorized users? Also probably yes, and I think there's a bit of evidence there that they are responding most negatively to motorized users in this case, and not a lot of evidence of responding on the trail in that kind of when there was a person and then a wildlife and then a person at that level, not responding that strongly to hikers and bikers. So when what can we do with this? An easy one is to think about how we can kind of bring these lines together. It would be as simple as how do we put people out on the landscape in a way that doesn't cause the animal to shift their daily rhythm. And it's probably as simple as not biking at 6 in the morning kind of thing. And I get why people do it because it gets hot. And this overall plot betrays the fact that there is a bunch of people out here. It's not 10,000 people because this is going to the mean, but there's still a lot of people that are out biking at that time or hiking.
And maybe that's one of the compromises, that we kind of constrain the period during which people are out on the landscape. Just a couple more things here to talk about other projects that are going on that are even maybe more promising than what I had kind of started in Mount Fernie. And one is the Hikos Trail, and in collaboration with Tourism Fernie and the ambassadors here. And this is an example where there's folks that have cameras along Hikos, and the same kind of design where there's paired cameras off the trail. But I think importantly, cameras that are a ways off of the trail as a whole. So you can kind of say, if there's a bunch of, say you get 5 moose here, for example, you might wonder, is that good or bad, or is 5 moose good? And this kind of gives an example of what would those, how many hits would you expect of moose in an area that isn't disturbed at all, but is in the same kind of habitat. And you can track things through time. If all of a sudden the goats move out of here or move out of here, and all of a sudden they show up over there, you have this sort of broader spatial control. So trying to look beyond just what's happening at the trail and trying to look at how maybe those trail networks change things at a bigger scale. Because you could imagine, in that Mount Fernie example, I'm looking just what's happening in that trail footprint, but we do not know if there wasn't twice as many out there before that whole network was built. We can't know that. We're looking within sort of as it is, but not looking elsewhere. Another really promising one from a science perspective is the Epic Trail that the Fernie Trails Alliance is a proponent for, and they have a proposal to build this trail from Coal Creek over to Hosmer. And I think these folks are keen to do some good science to understand what is the effect of a trail and their impact on wildlife. And so we have a plan to put out a bunch of cameras along the trail, which is not a trail right now, but the proposed trail, and then have cameras that are sort of 500 meters away to see if, as the trail gets built, if animals are moving away, what's the distributed effect of the trail, and then have a whole other set of cameras along the ridge as a control. So, trying to build designs that will provide robust evidence of whether these trails are having a negative effect. And this sort of design is a really strong way to do that, because you can look at the landscape as it was and say, if we build a trail through here, is it going to be bad? And these are folks that are keen to build trails, but are open to asking the question of what is our impact. So I certainly commend them for that. What are the take-homes? So the response to recreation differs by species and recreation type, which is super challenging for somebody that's supposed to manage this landscape. If you are managing a New York landscape with possums and whitetail and coyotes, those animals all respond probably similarly. But when you are trying to manage a landscape like the Elk Valley or the Southern Rockies as a whole, we have the greatest assemblage of large mammals in North America here. It's a special place, but it's a very challenging place because those animals all have very distinct needs. And so there's not one easy thing, don't build trails. We have to sort of figure out what each of those species needs, and then it's a values thing. We want people out there, but we don't want to compromise all the values of those species. Experimental evidence shows that recreation disturbs wildlife. That quad study on the collared elk, that's airtight. And generally, motorized recreation has larger impact than non-motorized for elk in an experimental treatment. That, I think there's still scientific uncertainty around, as I showed you, but I believe the experimental stuff better. What does the evidence say for Fernie? So I think it's as simple, these kind of results probably tell us 2 things about Fernie. One is to keep the recreational footprint tight. I think that's a big one. Sure, there's an effect. It's probably not huge. I don't think if we took everybody off the landscape and all the trails that all the environmental values in this valley would be fine. It's a cumulative effect type thing. There's a lot of things going on. But I don't think we want it to be, adversely affecting things in the future. So trying to keep that footprint tight around Fernie is important. And I was just biking up Roots a couple hours ago and noticed that that whole footprint around Roots is changing since I rode that trail a couple years ago. It's increasingly becoming a subdivision, and so we need to find a way to build houses around those trails and keep that footprint the same, as opposed to also then building a new trail network because Fernie is growing. Because if
it'll just add up until we have a wall-to-wall footprint up to the edge of the mountains, and then we will have a connectivity problem here. And think about being active during less active times for wildlife. And there's probably a sweet spot where it's not too hot, but the animals have probably gone to bed. And recreation and tourism groups are leading the way in Fernie to get good information. And I think that's a good sign that they want to know the answer. And I'm working for a lot of those folks, and we have an agreement that like they will get the answer regardless. Like, I will tell them, and we will tell everybody like what is found there. So it's a third-party type thing, and I think they're keen to do better. And I think that collecting good information leads to good decisions, and I think that those groups are trying to do that. That's basically all I have, but I have something just funny to share with you. I am always trying to find different ways to like do better graphics, and this is ChatGPT, if you guys ever played with this. I was trying to get a recreation ecology thing to just like summarize it all, and after like 6 times of doing it, I don't know what biking is. This is fishing. This guy quadding with a fish in the clouds. Dirt biking. And then the thing that really got me was this thing. Just wait. I had to zoom in on it. What is that? So, anyways. Thank you everybody, and yeah, keen to hear any questions, and let's have a discussion.